A particular type of nonprofits that are operating throughout our area are now the focus of both state and federal investigations. These groups, they provide co-payment assistance for people who need them to help pay for pricey prescription drugs. Now, critics say the nonprofits, they're fronts for big pharma, and they actually drive up prices, and the Justice Department is focused on whether they are violating any anti-kickback laws. But supporters, they say they help a lot of people who really need that help. And the Journal News has a feature piece on this. It's on LOHA.com right now, and it will be in Sunday's paper. Investigative reporter David Robinson is the co-author, and he joins us now. I'll be honest, I didn't know about copayment insurance. So give a little primer on it. What was the premise behind its creation, and what was it intended to do?
Yeah, I don't think you're alone in that. It's one of those kind of tools that really are in the kind of shadows of how we actually determine what we pay for our drugs. And essentially, they were created, late 80s, early 90s. As a, one of the individuals who we talked to, Dana Kuhn, is the CEO, who kind of started it in kind of religious aspects, and basically it was a charity aspect that would basically pick up the co-payment that basically people pay for the prescription drugs. You know, the insurance company has co-payments, and they require them because they want to direct all their clients to less expensive alternatives and generics.
It was a really fascinating piece, and I encourage people to read it. Maybe the best way to tell it is through some of the principles you identify. And let's start out with actually Dana Kuhn. A story that will take too long for us to say on TV here, but basically through a blood transfusion, he was infected, unknowingly infected his wife, who then later died. However, now he's an extremely highly compensated CEO and getting set to retire, making more than $500,000 a year. He claims he does God's work, but as you've looked into this, and there's supporters and critics of this, and we'll talk about them in a minute. Talk about where his money comes from and what he's actually done. What did you find out in your reporting?
Yeah, so the majority of the money for all these nonprofits is traced back to the pharmaceutical companies, and that's where the issue lies. Is that the federal investigators are looking into it because they say that it's an issue of a way for the drug companies to artificially inflate how much we pay for drugs and put these drugs on the market for a high price without having to face the public outcry, without having to face the idea that these drugs are priced too high for people to actually afford them, so that there's people dying of these serious illnesses because they can't afford their drugs.
It has its supporters, though. Kathleen Blaney, who you profiled in the piece, one of a few people who said, in her case, she had already lost sight in one eye. She's in her 80s, and if she didn't get this injection, this drug, she would lose sight in the other, and she claims the results of the drug are miraculous but very expensive. She claims without copay assistance, she basically would be blind, and she said, I think, living in a living hell or something. So talk about from her, is she just attaching a hope and a thanks to a group that you would have gotten the help otherwise? How would it work for her?
Yeah, for her, to be clear, hers is actually, she's covered initially, but she's concerned that the copay that she was approved for, she's going to have to tap into because her insurance will eventually not cover her drug. But there's other examples who are currently using it for $200,000 a year in incurable cancer drugs. And essentially, their support is monetary. Their support for the issue, the support for the copayment assistance is because without it they would be in this living nightmare. They would be, some of them would be dead. They wouldn't be able to afford their drugs. They'd be bankrupt in a matter of years, and they'd be left with no choices. So their support is kind of involuntary, I guess, is a way to put it. As opposed to the CEOs that we talked to, that their support is a different kind of monetary connection. It's those exorbitant salaries that we were talking about there.
In fact, one former CEO had some criticisms attached to this, and then there was also another person who said, hey, get rid of this thing altogether and just lower drug prices. It doesn't have to be, if you don't have this, what do you do? Just get rid of it altogether and find a way to not have these inflated prices that Big Pharma obviously is self-interested in. Is there merit to that?
Yeah, it's an oversimplification. It's an idea of, okay, who's going to get the drug makers to lower the price? And that's where both sides agree that it's in the lawmakers' court. It's the idea of passing some type of legislation or wielding the power of the federal government to negotiate these drug prices, using Medicare, Medicaid, which are the two biggest players in the market anyway, to negotiate.
It even gets further complicated. I know the ACA, Obamacare is always a contentious debate, but in terms of how it applies for that. If you get if that's your health insurance, whether or not this copay assistance is even applicable there.
Well, that was one of the issues that kind of was the impetus for this whole investigation. This whole kind of thing came to a head because there was a lot of concern that the ACA were going to lead to a flooding of the ACA marketplaces with a bunch of really sick people, and it was going to bankrupt all these things. Nobody would sell these plans on the exchanges. That basically led to an idea where they passed a rule where health plans, health insurance companies were able to drop a bunch of really sick people. These co-payment assistant groups, their kind of pushback on this issue is that, well, if we're not here, who's going to do it? You know, these people are going to be kicked off their health plans, and there's nobody here that's going to pick up that bill.
Finally, you mentioned the Justice Department's getting involved, and also state. we know in the headlines where the Justice Department is at the moment. Do you have faith that something's going to get done here? Every time we trust that it's going to be handled on the legislative level, then you get into complications as to who's the big political donors, and obviously Big Pharma obviously writes big checks every year. Do you have confidence that all of a sudden there's some scrutiny, long overdue, some would argue, for this, and something happens at the end or not?
I mean, there has been some settlements reached already. So prior to this Department of Justice, there has been some settlement reached with some of these players to say, you know, don't do that anymore. Basically, they hit them with a large fine. They said, you know, you're breaking the rules, or at least skirting the rules, and you're directing patients to the companies that are giving you the money. And if you still play in a field where you're not necessarily playing favorites, okay, there might be a place for you in the long run. You know, these co-payments might be able to survive if you do it in a way that's not directing patients in a way that drug companies know that they can put a drug on the market and get enough of the patients to be paying this, and then passing all that cost off to the insurance companies, to the rest of the consumers in the marketplace, then potentially there's a long-term solution here. So there has been some settlements, but now they're trying to say the whole system seems to be a little corrupt, if not acting improperly, and they have to start really reaching these deals pretty quickly, or else the economics are going to catch up with them pretty fast.
We shall see. Great reporting, as I said. You can check it out in Sunday's paper or online right now at lowhead.com. David, as always, thank you.
Thank you.
Coming up next, a look at the famous Hudson Valley painter Thomas Cole, whose work now featured as a special exhibit at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Even though he lived and worked more than 150 years ago, he's getting renewed interest, and it's partially about politics. We'll explain after this.